The Crossroads Chapter 28. What time are we going tomorrow? Jamie asked Tomas as he and Angela dried the dishes after their dinner of instant rice, canned beans, and turkey slices. We're not going anywhere tomorrow. Jamie blinked. How could he not remember? For the hearing, May 16th, that's tomorrow. What time? We, Tomas emphasized and repeated, are not going anywhere. What are you talking about? Mr. George won't let you go. No, I'm not letting you go. What? He dropped the dishcloth on the floor with protest. Since when did Tomas play the strict guardian card? Is this about missing school? I already told Mrs. I would be absent. She gave me the extra homework, and I've already done it. It's okay. Tomas shook his head. No, it's not okay. But I have to go. I've worked so hard, and I have testimonies to present. And Don thanks you for that. I can present them if you'd like. But you're still not going. Even Donatici knows better than to go with us to a detention center. You don't get it, Jamie begged. But Tomas grabbed the plastic plate from his hands and threw it across the trailer like a frisbee. It bumped against the wall and dropped face down on a cushion that became Angela's bed. Tomas pointed a finger in his brother's face. You don't get it. The hearing is held at a detention center, the same place they've been holding Don for 3 weeks, and the same place they keep every other undocumented individual they find. You go in there without any papers, and you might as well be turning yourself in. This couldn't be happening. Not after everything he'd done. Mr. George said with a special immigrant thing, I won't get deported. But we haven't even filed that yet. I need to become your legal guardian first, and we're going to do all that after the hearing. Jamie planted his feet on the floor and crossed his arms. Once since you're not my legal guardian, then you can't tell me what to do, and I want to go. Tomas grabbed the collar of Jamie's shirt and pulled him so close he could smell the turkey and beans on his breath. Absolutely not. They're just one-way ticket to getting you back to Guatemala and murdered the second you arrive. Tomas let him go, muttered some words under his breath, and then pulled out his phone. Read this. He tossed the phone to Jamie. Angela rested her chin on his shoulder to read it too. Dear Tomas, Jamie and Angela's lives are in grave danger. If they stay here, they will die. If they go to you, they might survive. We must risk the lives of our treasured children to keep them safe. It sounds idiotic, and perhaps it is, but please understand, we think it is the only way. I know we're asking for more of you than any parent should have to ask their son and nephew. We're desperate. Parents without another choice. Parents who love their children so much, we have to let them go. Jamie scrolled the screen up and then reached for Angela's hand. She didn't pull away. I feel like I'm losing all my children, but at least I know you're safe, and I want the same for Jamie and Angela. We love you all so much. We'd rather not be together than lose anyone else. Please take care of them, Tomas. Please be the parents we can no longer be. With great love, Mama and Tia Rosa. So they do care, Angela said in a small voice as Jamie scrolled the screen up and read the email again. I worried they didn't, that they wanted to get rid of us. I thought the same thing, Jamie agreed in the same low and ashamed voice. How dare Diego put that idea in his head in the first place? But mostly, how could Jamie have been so gullible to believe anything Diego said? Forward this to my email, Jamie handed Angela the phone after reading it a second time. So you see, Tomas said when he got the phone back, they're trusting me to take care of you. I can't do that if you're trying to get yourself in trouble. I don't want to get in trouble. I want to help Don, Jamie insisted. He knew what was at stake, the danger he would be in. But he hadn't been there for Miguel and Abuela, no matter what everyone said. He did play a part in their deaths. With Don, he still had a chance. He had to make things right. Still not happening. Abuela would roll over in her grave, and the fact would kill our parents if, despite all their efforts to keep you safe, you throw it all away. Tomas waved him off in disgust before bolting out the door. Jamie stood there, unable to move as he replayed the scene. Angela put an arm around him, making him realize he was shaking. He's scared for all of us. Too much uncertainty. Jamie understood that. He knew the fear, the helplessness. He remembered all too well what he and Angela went through to get here. Things they hadn't even shared with anyone else because it was too painful. But he also knew he'd never forgive himself if he did nothing. Can I sleep in your bed tonight? He asked. Brush your teeth and get your pillow. She kissed him on the top of the head, just like their mothers used to do. Her bed was meant for one person, not two adolescents and a dog, but Jamie had spent half of his life sleeping at Angela's house, and the other half with her and Maguel at his house when Tia worked late. There was nothing weird about it. Instead, it was the most comfortable he'd felt in a long time. Except for that one miserable night, he was sure he'd lost her for good. He'd slept next to her all through their journey. Now he realized how much he missed her, gently breathing in and presence. When she brushed a strand of hair away from his face and moved their mamas had learned from Abuela, he wondered if she'd missed him too. He didn't hear Tomas enter the trailer that night, but they heard him leave at dawn. They're heading to the hearing, Angela said, as if she knew he wasn't asleep either. He digested the statement for half a second, then rolled off the bed, changed into his jeans, and pulled the hoodie over his t-shirt he'd slept in. Take your phone. He nodded, placing the phone in his pocket and tucking the sketchbook Diego had given him into his waistband. My play is tomorrow night. Please don't miss it, Angela said. I won't. Be careful. He held her gaze for a second, looking into her eyes that were like their mama's, but at the same time uniquely her own. She couldn't be more family if she tried. I love you, he said. I love you too. And he left the trailer without another look. A couple of silhouettes moved inside the barn light. Jamie bet anything Tomas was giving Mel and Lucas last-minute details about the cattle and horses. Tomas's truck stood in front of the trailer, just a few meters away from Jamie. No one would see him, except Jamie had a feeling they weren't taking Tomas's truck. The truck was old and rickety. No, they'd go in Mr. George's sleek, six-tire vehicle, the one parked in front of the big house, 100 meters away. There wasn't time to think or plan. Any second, Tomas would turn around and see Jamie from the barn. Any moment, Mr. George would come out with the big house and start the engine. Jamie pulled the hood over his head to hide his face, a superstition from when he was little, and thought if he couldn't see then he couldn't be seen, and crouched low as he dashed to the expensive truck. He braced his hands on the top of the sidewalls, vaulted into the bed. He landed on the hard ridges of the black bed liner and tucked into a tight ball in the corner shadows created by the cab. Not a few seconds later, Mr. George opened up the kitchen door. Jamie kept his face hidden, but couldn't tell by the footsteps who it was. Tom, let's go, he called out to the barn. Please, Mr. George, Donna Chichi said from the farther away, probably from the door. Bring my husband home. You better start cooking because we're celebrating tonight, the booming voice came from right above Jamie. Just like with a rattlesnake, he didn't dare move the slightest bit. The rancher got into the truck and started driving to the barn. The truck barely stopped when Tomas got in. The roar of the diesel engine drowned out any further noise as they drove down the track to the highway. Still hugging the shadows under the cab, Jamie stretched against the width of the truck to brace himself and keep from rolling all over the place and banging his head. Mr. George's truck had much better suspension than Tomas's, but it still was a bumpy ride. They turned onto the highway and the train became smooth as ice. He rolled onto his back, tucked his arms under his head, and watched the sky lighten. They couldn't have driven for more than half an hour when Mr. George pulled off to the side of the road. The truck leaned heavily on Tomas's side, and Jamie contracted back to a ball, trying to be invisible. It didn't work. "Why don't you ride up in front with us?" Jamie remained still. Maybe Mr. George was talking to a hitchhiker they came across on the side of the road, except a sharp poke in his shoulder said otherwise. "Come on, get in." With nothing else to do, Jamie uncurled himself and accepted the hand Mr. George offered to climb out of the truck bed. In the passenger seat, Tomas had his arms crossed over his best shirt and only tie, his face angrier than it had been last night. He hissed before Mr. George followed Jamie into the truck. "I helped Don," Jamie said with his chin up in English. Tomas turned away, but not before muttering a few choice words that if Abuela had heard, would have earned him a mouth-washing. "Welcome aboard, son." Mr. George clapped a hand on Jamie's shoulder before putting the truck back in gear. "No, not welcome, not happy," Tomas said in English, slowly so Jamie could understand. "You're staying in the car. Stay in car." "Now, Tom, you can't do that," Mr. George reasoned. "You leave a kid in a car for a few hours, and that's called child abuse." Thomas was unimpressed and turned his face out towards the window. Jamie hadn't understood everything the rancher said, but he got the gist. He was going to the trial, and there was nothing Tomas could do to stop him. He turned to Mr. George, anything to keep wondering if Tomas was right, and he'd just doomed himself to imprisonment, deportation, and assassination. "How you see me?" Jamie pointed to the bed. "I noticed your scrawny lump as soon as I went to open the door back at the ranch. You knew he was there from the start, and you let him come with us? How could you?" Tomas said through tight lips. He ran his hands through his gelled hair. "I know he's your brother, and you're worried, but I'm still your boss. You don't talk to me like that," Mr. George scolded, and he shifted his large cowboy hat. "I let him come because I know you would have done the exact same thing if I were in your shoes. You Rivera brothers stop at nothing to help the people you care about. I would like to think that's a good thing." Jamie only got part of what Mr. George said, but knew it was important and complimentary. At any rate, it kept Tomas from talking for the rest of the ride. Nothing stood nearby the detention center except brown bushes, more scraggly than the ones on the ranch. A tall barbed wire fence surrounded the building. Jamie gulped. Maybe he should wait in the truck. Tomas was right. Jamie didn't want to be detained and have to stay here. He wished Angela had joined them. She would have put an arm around him and made him feel like nothing was impossible with her at his side. "You can do this. You've come too far to stay in the truck." A voice that sounded like a mixture between Angela and Abuela thumped in his head. He slid out of the truck and took a deep breath. "Best leave your phones behind. Now that everyone has recording devices, I don't think they'll let them in," Mr. George said. Jamie hesitated. If he got in trouble, he wouldn't be able to call for help. If he tried to smuggle in the phone and got caught, he'd definitely be in trouble. With a sigh, he dropped the phone on the glove compartment next to Tomas's. Mr. George stashed his hip pistol under the seat, placed his hat on the dashboard, and together they walked into the detention center. As they passed through the barbed wire fence, Tomas reached for Jamie's hand. Inside the building, Mr. George and Tomas showed their IDs, but the guard didn't ask Jamie for anything and waved him through the metal detector. The device beeped and flashed an angry red light when Jamie went through. The look of panic and horror on Tomas's face must have mirrored his own. The guard, however, didn't even raise an eyebrow. "Do you have anything in your pockets?" Heart-thumping, Jamie pulled out the sketchbook from his waistband. The guard flipped through the book, half bored, before handing it back to Jamie as he passed through the detector a second time, beep-free. He and Tomas let out a simultaneous sigh of relief, and then, still in sync, together muttered, Gracias a Dios. In the waiting area, they met Mr. George's lawyer, Hope Moreno, who greeted Mr. George with a shake of his hand. But Tomas and Jamie, each with a traditional kiss on the cheek. She looked taller than Tomas and could easily be mistaken for a gringo with light brown hair and skin so pale she'd burn if the sun so much as winked at her. You must be Jamie, she said in flawless Spanish, but with a distinctively Caribbean accent. May I ask you something? He asked the lawyer in a low voice. What's up? She whispered back. Jamie's shoulders relaxed just a bit. No, this was no gringa. She was one of them, a Latina, with all the self-assurance and determination he knew from his own family. Is it safe for me to be here? She laughed. Not a mean laugh, but one that was sweet and relieving. This isn't the movies. No one's going to organize a prison break and take you hostage. But this hearing is about Dawn. No one's going to care about you. She gave his hand a squeeze and switched to English to discuss the court procedures with Mr. George. A different guard led them into an empty white room. Behind them, the doors slammed shut with an ominous click of locks being secured. They were trapped. Tomas put his arm around Jamie. The height difference between them wasn't so obvious anymore, but he still felt like a little kid needing his big brother to protect him. A few seconds later, though, it felt like hours, the door on the other side of the empty room opened with a buzz. The guard showed them down a hall and into the courtroom, maybe because it was a detention center instead of a courthouse. But this room looked nothing like the fancy courts on TV, just a desk at the front, 2 tables, 2 columns of folding chairs, no jury, no fancy furniture. Good, less intimidating. Senora Morano waved them to some chairs at the back while the hearing ahead of them took place. Across the aisle, and a few rows up, a dozen men in orange jumpsuits sat in a cluster supervised by 2 guards. Jamie searched for Don and had to look a few times before he found him. 3 weeks in prison and without his cowboy hat, Jamie's friend was barely recognizable. Bits of white hair stood up in random patches, as if some balding disease he didn't know about had spread evenly. The brown leathery skin hung on his face, giving him thick jowls he hadn't seen before, and he slouched, something after centuries of horseback riding Jamie never thought he'd be capable of doing. He wanted to rush over to the man and comfort him, as he had comforted Jamie after the news of Abuela. If only Jamie could tell him everything that had happened, about the new ranch hands, of learning how to ride, about finding his friend Jokin, and the trouble she'd been through in a different detention center. He wanted to tell him that nothing on the ranch had been the same without him. As if he could feel Jamie staring at him, Don looked over his shoulder. Jamie and Tomas waved and Mr. George nodded. Don blinked a few times, as if he were outside and the sun's glare blinding him. Jamie kept waving and smiling. A few of the other inmates snickered, and one even waved back, and then Don finally seemed to trust his eyes and he smiled in return. He braced himself against the empty seat in front of him and hoisted himself to more upright sitting position, with his shoulders square and placed back. Even with the fancy lawyer jargon and the words he'd never be able to pronounce, Jamie could tell the hearing before them wasn't going well. When the other lawyer's client, Juan Garcia, was summoned, 2 men in orange jumpsuits stood up. But both were named Juan Garcia. Both were from Mexico, and the lawyer didn't know which one was her client. Senora Marino whispered in his ear and shook her head. The other lawyer agreed to represent both of the Juan Garcias. But Jamie thought they would have been better off representing themselves. This lady's paperwork was all disorganized. The judge had to keep repeating herself, to which the lawyer kept saying, I don't know. which even Jamie knew couldn't be good. When the judge made her decision, Senora Marino shook her head again. They all rose from their seats as the judge stepped out of the room. Jamie asked what was going on when they settled back in their seats. The judge has to take a break, Tomas answered. No, I mean with those other guys. Juan Garcia. Squared, Jamie asked. It's not good, Senora Marino answered him. Immigrants are not like criminals. They're not entitled to a public defender, and it's hard to get anywhere without a lawyer. She used her lips to motion at the other lawyer. The other lawyer is a disgrace. One Juan got caught shoplifting some food. She couldn't get him out. The other Juan, his bond got approved for $20,000. His family will never come up with that money. They're both stuck here, or whatever they get transferred to. The judge is tough, and the lawyer didn't help. They rose from their seats again when the judge returned. Senora Marino seemed to look at all the men in orange jumpsuits and resisted the temptation to sigh. Jamie sighed for her as he squeezed his sweaty palms. Senora Marino's words, "This judge is tough," repeated in his head. But as soon as Don's case was called and Senora Marino began talking, the difference between the lawyers was astonishing, even if Jamie didn't understand most of what she said. Your Honor, my client, Senora Delgado, is an honest and hardworking man. He is the kind of man everyone wants to have as a neighbor and a real asset to the community. The judge nodded and looked through some of her papers. How long has Mr. Delgado lived in the United States? Over 60 years, Your Honor. Senora Marino responded without having to consult any files. There's a record of him having worked in a Mustang roundup that took place 62 years ago. From where Jamie sat and looked like a lawyer handed to the judge a photocopy of an old newspaper article, the photograph from the big house, the one that showed a handful of men leaning against the fence as they stared wide-eyed Mustangs. How had she known it took place 62 years ago? Has he been employed all this time? At Dundee Ranch, Mr. Georges Dundee Sr. hired him the day the photo was taken, but he never filed any taxes. For the first time, Senora Marino's confidence faltered. No, Your Honor, he never earned enough. A silence fell over the room as the judge reviewed her papers. A breath caught in Tomas's throat. What happened? Jamie whispered. He thought it had been going well. The government doesn't like when you don't pay taxes. Tomas explained in a low voice. Even if you're undocumented, you're expected to pay a percentage of what you earn. Jamie grabbed his brother's hand and gave it a squeeze. It couldn't be over. Your Honor, if I may. Mr. George stood and motioned to the front of the room. The judge nodded her head, inviting him to come forward. George Dundee, Jr. The rancher had introduced himself. Mr. Delgado has lived with my family longer than I can remember. It's true he never earned enough to file taxes, but that's only because he's never accepted much pay. So I pay him in other ways. When he admires a mare, I buy him her foal. If his wife says her back hurts, I get them a new bed. The kitchen is always stocked. The local feed store bills me for any clothes he needs, and I have him and his wife on my family's health care plan. There isn't anything in the world I wouldn't give him, but he's not into material things. The judge leaned forward and addressed Don. Is this true? Don stood to address the judge. His voice came out raspier than usual, and he spoke in Spanish. Instantly, a small man with thin mustache who was seated near the judge translated the Spanish. For what do I need money when I have everything I desire? The judge nodded for Mr. George and Don to sit down, and then turned to Senora Marino to continue with the case. Senora Marino presented further facts and papers, and every time the judge asked a question, she had an immediate answer. The judge listened intently and glanced at her forms and nodded in agreement several times. And then Jamie's heart stopped at the sound of his name. Jamie Rivera, Signora Marino looked at him and continued to speak in slow, understandable English. Mr. Dundee told me you'd like to help. Please come tell the judge about Don Delgado. Tomas grabbed Jamie's arm and shook his head no. Jamie hugged his sketchbook to his chest and stood. He walked to the front of the room, feeling all eyes on him. Tomas and Mr. George, Signora Marino, and the disaster lawyer, Don and all the inmates, the security guards, and the judge. When he passed by Signora Marino, she whispered, "You can use the interpreter if you want." She nodded to the mustached man who had translated for Don. Jamie shook his head no. If he was going to do this, it had to be this way. There was no Bible to swear an oath, like they did on TV. Instead, Jamie stood in front of the judge with his back to the rest of the room. His legs began to shake. "What's your name?" the judge asked. "Jamie Rivera." "And who are you?" He took a deep breath and made an effort to speak in his best English. I'm Don's friend and family." "And what do you have to say about him?" Jamie turned to the sketchbook in his hands. His legs stopped shaking, and he knew this was one thing he could express correctly. He opened his sketchbook and showed the judge the illustrations of Don's life, based on the stories he gathered from everyone in their community. "I no speak English good," he explained, "but I listen. People talk about the life of Don. I draw what they talk about." He pointed to the first sketch, one of Diego's. Dad had told him while in the principal's office. "These picture, car gets stuck in snow. Don and horse save man from snow. Take man home, save life." He skipped one and flipped to the next page. This story had come from a local sheriff. Jamie had been hesitant to approach the law enforcement, but Donatici had insisted the story was crucial and that the sheriff was nice, and he was. He gave them all jelly donuts and an orange Fanta. "Police look for gone boy. Don see foot." He paused, not sure how to say the word he was looking for. "Yes," the judge looked through the papers and pulled out a letter. "Your local sheriff wrote a letter telling me how Mr. Delgado found footprints in dry sand, which led the search and rescue to find the lost hiker." "Yes, help find boy." He wanted to explain that Don understood the land and the animals, knowing things no one else did. But that was too complicated to explain. He settled for turning to the next image. That person hadn't been home, but Donatici had told him the story anyway. "These horse have baby trouble. Horse and baby no die." "Tell me about this one," the judge pointed to Jamie's favorite drawing, the one he had skipped because he was saving it for the last, the one he had made while visiting Sanny, Carla's great-grandfather. "Don always helped people, says all people his family." Here Don makes Arnett, the interpreter, responded with the similar word in English, harness. "Yes, he make harness and put television on horse. Take telly to sick friend. 60 years, friend, still have telly." A chuckle came from the back of the room. Mr. George shook his head in disbelief as he suddenly realized what happened to the wedding present his parents had given the old man. The judge herself smiled as she continued to thumb through the other drawings and testimonies. When she came to the end, she handed the book back to Jamie. "You drew all these?" "Yes, Judge," he nodded. "You're very good at depicting events through your art." "Thank you. I want to show Don a good man, important man." The judge leaned forward slightly and pushed her reading glasses up her nose, and she looked at him. "And why do you call him Don?" Jamie didn't blink. "In Spanish, Donnie's for respect. Donna is respect for woman. Everyone respect and love Donna Vincente." The judge nodded. "You may return to your seat." Jamie stood and extended his hand like he did with Mises at school. "Thank you, Donna Judge." She tilted her head in surprise before accepting his handshake. Walking back to his chair, Mr. George mimed clapping, while Tomas tried to hide his embarrassment with his hand. "You're lucky you're a cute kid," Tomas mumbled. "And I just being polite," he whispered back. The judge glanced through the papers in front of her one last time before looking up to address the whole room. After reviewing this case, reading the character references and experiencing such a captivating drawings, it is my decision to release Vicente Delgado on the proposed $4,000 bond. A cheer exploded in the courtroom. The inmates who understood English clapped for Don on the back. The old man stood, shook Senora Marano's hand, and left the courtroom with the guard. Wait, where's he going? Jamie asked. He's changing back into his regular clothes. Tomas put his arm around Jamie in his rough, teasing way. You didn't think they let him keep the orange jumpsuit, did you? Senora Moreno gathered her files and with a proud smile started heading toward them. Every inmate in the room extended a hand to her. She passed out her business card to each one while the other lawyers hid her sulking hiding by disorganized avalanche of files. They exited the same way they came, through the white lockdown room, and bypassed the metal detectors to the waiting area at the front doors. There stood an office with a window where Mr. George handed over the bank-issued check he had gotten the day before and signed the papers presented to him. You are great, Jamie, Senora Marino said, placing a hand on his shoulder. We'll see each other soon as we start preparing your application for the special immigration juvenile visa. Jamie opened his mouth to say something and then shut it. Senora Marino must have read his mind, because she whispered, Tomas told me, you don't know if you want to stay here. Jamie shifted from one foot to the other. He didn't want to seem ungrateful for everything his family and Mr. George had done, but Senora Marino looked Jamie in the eye and said, just because we get you papers doesn't mean you have to stay here forever. Maybe things in Guatemala will change, and you'll be safe. It'll be safe for you to return, even to visit your parents. He repeated her words in awe. Claro, he reassured. Once your papers are in order, you can leave and return to the United States whenever you like. You can even choose not to return if you don't want to. But at least then it will be your choice instead of the choice being made for you. The possibility of visiting his parents changed everything. To be able to see them again and still return to live safely with Tomas if he wanted. The thought that could only happen in his imagination. Do I need to worry about qualifying for this juvenile visa thing? Jamie asked. Do you trust me? She asked back. Yes, definitely. She winked. Then you don't have to worry. We're going to make sure you get to stay as long as you like. She said goodbye to Mr. George and Tomas and left. Prison had not done Don any favors. Even with his cowboy hat back on, he seemed too old, too weak, nothing like a man who spent all day on a horse and all night with birthing cows. His chest sunk in like a hollow crevice, and yet he seemed to have finally gained weight and developed a belly. His beaded belt with Sanny had made him was 2 notches looser. Again, Jamie noticed how he didn't hold himself as straight as he used to, making him smaller and frailer than he had been. Mr. George greeted him with a handshake and a pat on his shoulder. We've missed you. Gracias. They stood like that for a few seconds until Mr. George nodded and released his hand. Then Tomas grabbed the old man in a tight hug and didn't hide his tears. You know how crazy it's been without you? Don't ever leave me again. Next time, listen to me when I say Manuel Vega's herd ain't worth their salt. Tomas buried his face in the old man's shoulder. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken that road. I didn't mean. I don't blame you. Don patted his back like he did his horse. Who knew they would be there? I was so grumpy. I know you were just trying to get home sooner. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. There's nothing to make up. We're going home now. That's all that matters. Tomas let him go and blinked like he was agreeing. But Jamie knew his brother better than that. Knew that Tomas would do things, even if they were little things, to make sure the old man knew how much he cared. Jamie walked slowly to Don and wrapped his arms around the old man. His shoulder blades and spine poked Jamie's hands. Don rubbed Jamie's back as if it were Jamie who needed the comforting. "It was very brave of you to come here. The judge liked you," the old cowboy said. Jamie smiled. "I want to make a difference. I had to try. And you succeeded. Your art is very moving." Don reached into his pocket and pulled out not only the 2 drawings Jamie had sent him, but the sketch Jamie had done quickly before they went to look at the bull calf, the sketch of Don on his horse. "You kept it." "It's what made me wake up every day and not aim for the sunset."